Some men age like oak trees. They weather brutal storms with a quiet grace, simply accepting the changing of the seasons and finding peace with the hand they are dealt. Silas Thorne was not one of those men. At 60 years of age, he hadn't found peace with his lot in life. He had merely laid down his weapons, surrendering to the crushing weight of time. To a passing stranger, surrender and peace might look exactly the same. Silas operated an independent lumber mill 15 miles beyond the misty, pine-choked borders of Oak Haven, Oregon. He lived on land his grandfather had cleared, working a massive stretch of deep timber, jagged ravines, and the heavy, suffocating silence of a man who has eaten dinner alone for over a decade. The mill turned a steady profit. The steel saw blades were kept razor sharp. The massive draft horses were well fed. The only thing rotting away in the damp Oregon air was Silas himself. It wasn't a loud or dramatic decay. Nobody in Oak Haven would have called him a broken man. He ate his meals, swung his heavy axe, spoke only when directly addressed, and maintained a pristine reputation as an iron-willed, decent worker. He attended the parish every Sunday morning and hauled raw lumber to the trading post on Wednesday afternoons. He returned to his empty cabin both times, the silence ringing in his ears, completely unchanged. His wife, Eleanor, had perished 12 years prior. It wasn't a swift accident. The wasting sickness had dragged on for 5 agonizing months, bleeding the color from her cheeks, while Silas watched, completely powerless. That slow, inevitable theft felt infinitely more cruel than a sudden tragedy. Following her burial, Silas plunged into an endless sea of hard labor. He chopped, sawed, and hauled timber until his muscles screamed, eventually sinking into a numb, echoing quiet that he mistook for healing. He was 60. He owned a profitable mill, a sturdy wagon, and a massive battle-scarred hound named Rusty, who only demanded a warm spot by the hearth. Silas had convinced himself that this meager, gray existence was enough. Everything shifted on a bitterly cold Tuesday in October. Silas had driven his wagon into Oak Haven solely to purchase iron nails, oats, and a tin of loose-leaf tea. He returned to the woods carrying a memory he couldn't shake. It was a name that suddenly felt heavier than the timber he hauled. Evelyn Vance had stepped off the train in Oak Haven precisely a month before Silas first crossed her path. She was 31, relocating from the busy streets of Portland to take over the local apothecary after old Dr. Higgins passed away. She possessed sharp hazel eyes, calloused hands, and a rare magnetic way of listening. When someone spoke, Evelyn didn't just wait for her turn to formulate a reply. She absorbed the words, dissecting them with genuine care. Within weeks, she became the sole obsession of Oak Haven's rumor mill, which was an undeniably small and restless town. 4 different bachelors had tried to court her. She treated each one with polite grace and rejected them with absolute, undeniable firmness. Harrison Caldwell, the heir to the regional shipping fortune, was a handsome, boastful man of 28. He had shipped her expensive imported chocolates on 2 separate occasions. Evelyn promptly distributed the sweets to the ragged orphans loitering near the docks. Harrison was mortified. Evelyn firmly believed the sugar served a far better purpose in the bellies of hungry children. Silas remained completely oblivious to the town's dramatic drama. He stayed 15 miles deep in the timberline, possessing zero desire to mingle with society. She was the one who broke the ice. "Pardon my interruption," Evelyn called out from the apothecary's wooden porch. "Do you happen to know a capable carpenter who can fix a shattered display cabinet? The damp rot ruined the back panel, and my medicinal herbs are spoiling." Silas yanked the reins, halting his draft horses. He stared down at her. She stared right back, her gaze steady, lacking any flutter of intimidation. She was simply a woman with a practical problem waiting for a practical solution. "Arthur Penhaligon," Silas grumbled, his voice rough like tree bark. "Blacksmith's brother. Tell him Silas Thorne sent you. He won't dare fleece you." "I appreciate that," she replied smoothly. "I am Evelyn Vance. I mix the remedies here." "I'm aware," he muttered. "Silas Thorne. I cut trees." "I'm aware," she echoed, a faint smirk playing on her lips. Silas clicked his tongue, driving the wagon forward. That brief exchange lasted exactly 18 seconds. Silas counted them in his head during the long ride back, a foolish detail he would rather swallow glass than admit out loud. However, he did deliberately seek out Arthur Penhaligon the following Wednesday, casually demanding to know if the apothecary's cabinet had been mended. "Fixed it yesterday," Arthur replied, shooting Silas a deeply amused, knowing look that the older man stubbornly ignored. "Fine," Silas grunted, tossing a sack of nails into his wagon before storming off. Arthur watched the gruff lumberjack retreat, chuckling under his breath. Evelyn finally appeared at his mill in mid-November. She had been visiting a young reckless logger named Toby, who lived 3 miles down the ridge and had recently suffered a nasty axe wound to his calf. Evelyn insisted on personally changing the boy's bandages to prevent infection. She reined her mare at Silas's property line on her journey back to town. "Those saw blades look freshly sharpened," she called out, leaning over the wooden fence. Silas was greasing the main gear. He slowly straightened up, wiping his blackened hands on a rag, visibly bewildered by her presence. "Much obliged. Young Toby claims you've stitched his leg up blindfolded." His mother exaggerates, but Toby did mention you possess a terrifying amount of patience with greenhorn loggers. She briefly glanced at the massive timber logs stacked nearby. "Apparently, you handle stubborn boys better than you handle actual conversation." "Trees don't talk back," Silas replied flatly. Evelyn let out a rich, unrestrained laugh. It was entirely genuine, the kind of startling joy that escapes before a person can censor it. "I will absolutely use that line the next time Toby whines about the sting of iodine, though comparing him to a slab of pine might hurt his pride." The corners of Silas's mouth twitched. He almost cracked a smile. Almost. She lingered by the fence for 20 minutes, discussing Toby's recovery, the apothecary's leaking roof, and the looming threat of a blizzard. Long after she vanished down the trail, Silas stood staring at the greasy gears. To his profound shock, the bitter, biting cold of the afternoon suddenly felt remarkably warm. She returned 2 weeks later, brandishing a heavily worn journal detailing local bark remedies. He accepted it cautiously. He had memorized the text a decade ago during Eleanor's sickness. Yet he read every single page again that night by the fire, fiercely lying to himself that he merely needed a refresher on willow extracts. By her third visit, Silas had inadvertently prepared for her arrival. He had boiled water and poured 2 heavy ceramic mugs of strong black tea. He stared at the 2 steaming mugs resting on his battered oak table, a sudden wave of panic hitting him as he realized what this domestic setup implied. He violently forced himself to stop overthinking. When Evelyn rode up at 3:30, she hopped off her mare and walked straight into his cabin without an ounce of hesitation or theatrical modesty. He silently handed her the mug. She accepted it, sat at the table, and glanced from the tea to Silas and back to the tea. Nobody uttered a syllable. Rusty the hound lumbered into the kitchen, sniffed the air between them, let out a massive sigh, and immediately turned around to sleep on the porch. "Brilliant hound," Evelyn murmured into her mug. "Aye," Silas rasped. "Knows a crowded room when he sees one." Silence stretched out again, thick, but entirely devoid of tension. Evelyn smiled down at her dark reflection in the tea. Silas stared intensely at the dancing flames in the fireplace. For the first time in 12 years, his home felt utterly, inexplicably right. Naturally, Oak Haven noticed. Small towns survive on the lifeblood of rumors. By late December, everyone knew the apothecary was taking weekly rides up the mountain. Evelyn passed the bakery, the trading post, and the parish, a bright target for a community drowning in idle time. Opinions flew through the cobblestone streets with rabid enthusiasm. Mrs. Gable, the town baker who had known Silas since his youth, was aggressively delighted. "Poor man has been a walking ghost since Eleanor," she declared over trays of warm bread. 12 agonizing years. I was terrified he'd rot up there." Meanwhile, Harrison Caldwell's father, the wealthy shipping magnate, declared the entire spectacle vastly improper and made sure his elite circle knew it. Arthur Penelagon, when cornered at the blacksmith forge and pressed for juicy details, merely smirked. "He did ask if her cabinet was fixed," Arthur said cryptically. When pressed for meaning, he simply hammered a hot horseshoe and whistled a tune. Young Harrison Caldwell lacked such amusement. His fragile ego remained bruised from the rejected chocolates, and his pride could not fathom losing a woman to a grizzled, dirt-stained lumberjack twice his age. Harrison finally confronted Silas near the trading post on a freezing Thursday afternoon. "Word around town is that Miss Vance has been making regular trips to your mill, Thorne," Harrison sneered, desperate to project a casual confidence, but failing miserably. Silas slowly turned, his eyes cold and hard as winter ice. "She treats Toby's leg down the ridge. She visits the sick." Silas tossed the burlap sack of nails into the back of his wagon. "Have a productive afternoon, Harrison." He snapped the reins and guided his horses out of town. The entire way back up the mountain, Silas stubbornly told himself that the boy's jealousy meant nothing. It hadn't rattled him in the slightest. Rusty the Hound completely disagreed. The massive dog possessed an uncanny ability to smell a lie on his master, and that evening, Rusty refused to leave Silas's side, resting his heavy chin directly on the lumberjack's knee for hours. Down in Oak Haven, Beatrice, the town seamstress and self-appointed gossip-monger, had overheard the brief confrontation. She practically sprinted to the apothecary the next morning to report the incident to Evelyn. Evelyn listened intently as she crushed dried lavender in a mortar. So he secured his supplies and departed. "Precisely," Beatrice gasped, expecting a more dramatic reaction. "Excellent," Evelyn replied, tapping the pestle against the bowl. "That is the proper reaction." Beatrice gaped at her. "Proper reaction to what, dear?" Evelyn offered a tight, mysterious smile. "To ignoring foolishness." She returned to grinding the lavender, leaving the seamstress standing in the middle of the shop, completely bewildered. Evelyn hadn't told a single soul in Oak Haven the genuine reason she had abandoned Portland. She gave polite, sanitized answers at the baker's shop about craving the clean mountain air and desiring a quieter practice. But the truth was a heavy, complicated knot she was still learning how to untangle. She was waiting for the correct moment to explain it. Lately, she felt that moment approaching faster than she anticipated. Over the past year, Evelyn had learned a brutal lesson. There is a massive chasm between a life that looks successful to outsiders and a life that actually feels fulfilling to the person living it. She had spent 31 years letting polite society dictate the difference. Now she recognized the lie. She fled to the remote logging town to discover what she actually wanted. She certainly hadn't expected a grizzled, silent lumberjack to be part of that discovery. Yet there was a specific quality in Silas that she instantly recognized and fiercely craved. It wasn't his rough exterior or his tragic past. It was the intense, unbroken focus of his attention. When she spoke, he listened without formulating his own counterargument. He delivered harsh truths without a sugarcoating. He had brewed 2 mugs of tea before she even arrived and never demanded praise for his foresight. Evelyn had spent decades suffocating in ballrooms filled with people wearing elaborate social masks. Silas Thorne didn't wear a mask. He didn't perform. He didn't even seem to realize how incredibly rare his raw honesty was.
To Evelyn, that oblivious nature was his most intoxicating trait. During her 4th ride up the mountain, Evelyn repeatedly told herself she was merely checking on a rural neighbor. She rehearsed this lie out loud to her horse. When she arrived, Rusty the hound bounded to the gate, his tail whipping frantically, clearly possessing more wisdom about the situation than the humans involved.
Evelyn glared down at the ecstatic dog. "Keep your opinions to yourself," she muttered. Rusty let out a sharp, happy bark. "You are entirely unhelpful," she sighed, pushing past the gate. Author note: if you are enjoying this story of quiet rebellion and slow burn romance, let me know. It means the world to see where these characters resonate. Now, back to the bitter Oregon winter, where Silas Thorne is about to make a monumental, spectacularly foolish mistake. It happened in late January. They had established a comfortable rhythm. Following their tea, they usually wandered to the jagged ridge behind the mill, where the dense pine forest suddenly dropped off, revealing a sweeping view of the valley below. During autumn, the valley was a sea of fiery orange. Now it was locked in the stark, frozen grip of winter. The evergreens were heavy with snow, and the sky bruised into deep shades of violet and crushed charcoal as the sun vanished. They stood shoulder to shoulder on the ridge. Silas remained agonizingly silent. A heavy thought had been rotting in his mind for weeks, and he had fought violently to keep it buried. Rusty sat patiently between their boots, his golden eyes scanning the snowy valley, projecting the weary patience of a dog waiting for 2 blind humans to finally see the light. Silas finally broke. "Evelyn," his voice was gravelly, fighting the freezing wind. "I have to speak." She turned, pulling her woolen shawl tighter. "You need to stop coming up this mountain." He forced the words out, staring dead ahead at the snowdrifts.
You have 31 years to your name. I have 60. He swallowed hard. You are wasting your youth on a rotting stump of a man. You need someone who can... Silas, halt. Evelyn's voice cut through the frigid air like a freshly sharpened axe. You are making arrogant assumptions about my life without bothering to ask for my input. He froze. She was glaring at him with the exact same fierce, uncompromising look she gave merchants who tried to sell her spoiled herbs. It wasn't hateful, but it absolutely refused to tolerate his foolishness. "I am aware you are 60, she stated firmly, stepping directly into his line of sight. "I am perfectly capable of basic mathematics, but I don't care about the years on your bones. I care about you. You actually listen. You don't lie to me. You poured tea for 2 before I even knocked on your door, and you didn't demand a medal for it." Rusty glanced up at Silas. Silas stared down at the dog. "Don't look at me like that," Silas warned the hound. Rusty huffed, returning his gaze to the valley. Evelyn's fierce expression softened into something incredibly vulnerable and terrifyingly warm. "To me," she whispered, the wind carrying her words, "you are exactly what I need." The last fading light drained from the sky, plunging the ridge into twilight. Silas Thorne, a man who had violently ripped hope out of his chest 12 years ago, stood frozen. Suddenly, a wild, unnamed warmth erupted in his chest, completely obliterating the cold, lonely fortress he had spent a decade building.
He couldn't speak. Rusty, sensing the massive emotional shift, leaned his heavy, warm body against Silas's leather boot. It was the dog's method of providing stability during crises, and right now, Silas desperately needed an anchor. "You don't know the shadows I carry," Silas finally rasped. "I know the pieces that matter," Evelyn countered. "Eleanor," he choked out, the name tasting like ash. "I loved her. I watched her fade away. I've been a ghost in these woods for 12 years. I accepted that this empty life was my punishment." "It isn't a punishment," Evelyn said softly. "It's just a tragic chapter. It doesn't have to be the final one." Silas stared at her, his jaw tight. "Evelyn, in 10 years, I will be an old, broken man of 70.
You will only be 41. If I am even half the man then that I am today, he trailed off, the fear choking him. I will consider myself the luckiest woman in Oregon, she finished for him without missing a beat. He turned away, squeezing his eyes shut against the biting wind. Then Evelyn finally unraveled her own knot. She told him about Portland. She told him about Julian, a wealthy, arrogant lawyer from a prestigious family. He was the definition of proper. She described the suffocating engagement and the elaborate, expensive wedding she had shattered exactly a month before the ceremony. She told him why she ran. Silas absorbed every word, his focus absolute. You abandoned a wealthy engagement 4 weeks before the altar? He asked, his voice low. I did, she nodded, because it was a suffocating performance. It was expected of me, and what is expected is rarely what is right.
Then what is right? He challenged. She held his gaze, her hazel eyes blazing in the twilight. This, standing on a frozen ridge, speaking the ugly truth, with a man who brews my tea before I ask. She took a shaky breath. I didn't flee to the mountains searching for you, Silas, but I am not going to throw you away now that I've found you. Rusty let out a massive, theatrical yawn, shook the snow from his fur, and trotted back toward the warm cabin. Even the hound thinks this debate is settled, Evelyn pointed out. Silas watched the dog retreat. He always knows when the talking is done. Are we done talking? She challenged softly. Silas finally looked back at her. No, I don't believe we are. He didn't surrender instantly. That wasn't in his nature. He chewed on the conversation for 3 agonizing days, analyzing her words with the stubborn, cautious grit that had kept him alive in the timberlands. Rusty actively participated in this brooding, trailing Silas around the mill with an expression of deep, judgmental concern. I am processing, Silas barked at the dog on Wednesday morning. Rusty sat heavily in the sawdust. I know you think I'm a coward, Silas muttered. Rusty stared blankly at a nearby pine tree. You are a terrible companion, Silas grumbled, tossing his axe aside. He thought about Eleanor, not with crushing guilt, but with sudden clarity. Eleanor had been a fiercely practical woman. She used to scold him, insisting that the world was too brutal to invite unnecessary misery. She despised people who rejected warmth simply because they were afraid of getting burned. He analyzed Evelyn's words. Expected versus right. Evelyn had blown up her entire life because a loveless marriage was expected, but it wasn't right. Now she was forcing him to face the exact same mirror. Expected, a 60-year-old widower rots alone in the woods until the winter claims him. Right, something terrifying, something new. Silas didn't wait for Tuesday. He drove his wagon down the mountain on a Friday afternoon. Evelyn noticed the disruption in routine immediately. He hammered his heavy fist against the apothecary door. She was grinding herbs at her counter. She glanced up, saw his massive frame blocking the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, his battered hat clutched tightly in his massive hands. She slowly set her pestle down. It is Friday, Silas, she noted, her pulse spiking. I am aware. I have never visited on a Friday. I am aware. He stared down at his muddy boots. I found myself unable to wait until Tuesday. She studied him. The tension in the shop was thick enough to cut with a saw. Silas Thorne had finally stopped fighting his own stubborn ghost. He stepped over the threshold, bringing the scent of pine and cold iron into the warm shop. He had known his answer before he even hitched the horses. He just needed the courage to make the drive. Close the door behind you, Silas, she instructed softly. You're letting the winter in. He shut the heavy oak door. The weak gray light of the Oregon winter filtered through the frosty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards. Outside, Rusty the hound sat patiently on the boardwalk. Having successfully escorted his master down the mountain to secure his future, the dog rested his chin on his paws, utterly satisfied with his own handiwork. Silas stood rigidly in front of her counter. "I have been doing some heavy calculating," he stated, his voice a low rumble. "I know," Evelyn replied, crossing her arms. "You calculate like a glacier moves." "I am thorough," he corrected gruffly, which was entirely accurate. She leaned against the counter, projecting the endless patience of a woman dealing with a particularly stubborn child. "And what exact conclusions has this thorough calculating produced?" He looked at her, this brilliant, impossible woman who braved freezing mountain trails just to drink his bitter tea, who read his outdated forestry journals, and who stood on a frozen ridge and claimed he was exactly what she needed. "I have concluded," Silas began, his voice surprisingly steady, "that I have been operating my life under a set of foolish rules that require immediate dismantling." Evelyn's breath caught slightly, but she held her ground. "Rules such as?" "Such as the ridiculous belief that my age and my tragedies are a valid excuse to run away." He took a slow, deliberate step closer to the counter. "Run away from what, Silas?" she whispered. "From asking you to marry me." The apothecary shop fell completely silent, the kind of heavy quiet that follows a lightning strike. Evelyn didn't blink. She just stared at the massive lumberjack blocking her door, the snow melting off his broad shoulders and pooling on the floorboards. Outside, muffled by the thick winter snow, Rusty let out a sudden, booming bark at a stray alley cat, then settled back into a satisfied silence. "And have you discarded that foolish rule?" she asked, her voice trembling just a fraction. "I have," Silas grunted. He reached into his heavy wool coat and pulled out a plain silver band. It belonged to Eleanor. He had worn it on a leather cord around his neck for 12 years, tucked away like a hidden scar beneath his flannel shirts. He had taken it off that morning because he finally realized the silver was meant to catch the light, not hide in the dark. "I would consider it an honor," he said, the words heavy and deliberate, "if you would be my wife, knowing full well what that means. The gray hair, the isolated cabin, the freezing timberlines, the hound, and all the rest of my stubbornness." Evelyn stared at the silver ring, then up at his weathered face. "Silas Thorne," she breathed out, "you move slower than a glacier." "Is that an acceptance?" "It was never going to be anything else," she laughed, a bright, tearful sound. "I was just waiting for your brain to catch up with the reality of the situation." He slid Eleanor's silver band onto her finger in the dim, gray light of the apothecary. It wasn't an act of replacing his past. It was a bridge out of it. It proved that a heart can carry the heavy weight of yesterday without letting it crush the promise of tomorrow. Evelyn traced the metal, treating it not as a hand-me-down, but as a hard-won victory. Out on the freezing boardwalk, Rusty the hound thumped his heavy tail against the wood, utterly convinced he had orchestrated this entire romance single-handedly. They married in mid-March, right when the Oregon frost began to thaw into mud. The local parish was absolutely packed to the rafters. Half the logging camps shut down just so the men could attend. Harrison Caldwell forced a polite, tight-lipped smile from the back row. Mrs. Gable, the baker, openly wept into a flour-dusted handkerchief in the front pew, aggressively whispering to anyone who would listen that she had predicted this exact outcome years ago. Evelyn did not wear white. She despised the tradition. Instead, she wore a deep, vibrant emerald green,
the exact color of the Oregon pine needles and the heart of spring. Silas stood at the altar, staring at her as she walked down the aisle, the terrifying realization of how close he came to dying a lonely old man, hitting him like a falling oak.
Rusty waited faithfully by the church steps. When the heavy wooden doors swung open, the massive dog howled with joy, tackling Silas and nearly knocking the bride into the mud. Several townsfolk laughed. Silas just patted the dog's head, completely unsurprised by the chaos. The cabin on the mountain changed that spring. Silas didn't knock down walls or add rooms. The structure remained the same, but the suffocating 12-year silence was completely eradicated. The dead air was replaced by the chaotic, wonderful noise of two stubborn people sharing a life, somehow making the cramped cabin feel like a mansion. Evelyn possessed a massive collection of heavy medical texts and botany journals. During her first week, Silas spent 3 evenings locked in his workshop. He built her a massive floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelf, sanding the wood until it was smooth as glass. When she saw it, she declared it the most romantic gesture she had ever witnessed. Silas was genuinely confused. "It's just wood and nails." "You built it without me begging," she pointed out, running her hand over the polished grain. "You measured the shelves to perfectly fit the massive medical volumes I brought. You used your highest grade oak." Silas scratched his beard. "I suppose that is romantic." "Silas," she sighed playfully, "it is painfully romantic." He grunted, returning to his supper, but a proud smile tugged at his lips. Their son, Julian, was born their 3rd winter together. The boy inherited Evelyn's terrifyingly direct stare and Silas's bottomless patience, a combination that made him a force of nature by the time he could walk. Silas was 63 when the boy arrived. The age gap kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling rafters in a cold sweat. He finally confessed his fear to Evelyn while chopping firewood in the yard. "Can you teach the boy how to swing an axe without losing a toe?" she asked from the porch. "Obviously." "Can you teach him how to read a coming storm, how to properly bait a hook and never break a promise?" "Yes." "Then you are exactly the father he requires," she stated. Silas never brought up his age again. Their daughter, Clara, arrived 2 years later. She was tiny, incredibly loud, and possessed her mother's razor-sharp wit. The silent mountain cabin was now permanently deafening. By her 5th birthday, little Clara could systematically argue her way out of eating vegetables, a trait Silas blamed entirely on Evelyn's influence. Evelyn countered that the girl was simply paying attention to the world around her. 10 years after he knocked on the apothecary door, Silas sat heavily on his wooden porch on a humid July evening. Somewhere down by the creek, Julian and Clara were screaming at each other over a captured bullfrog. Silas recognized the cadence of their argument and knew neither child would remember the fight by breakfast. He took a sip from his mug and realized he didn't care about the noise at all. A new hound, an overly energetic pup named Buster, who possessed Rusty's golden eyes, was snoring loudly across Silas's boots. Evelyn pushed the screen door open, carrying her own mug of steaming peppermint tea. She had aggressively banished his bitter black coffee years ago. Silas still grumbled that it was a tragedy. Evelyn insisted it was why his heart hadn't exploded yet. It was a decade-long debate they had zero intention of settling. She sat next to him on the wooden bench, her shoulder pressing comfortably against his. They stared out at the jagged, darkening timberline. "I was a fool, you know," Silas murmured, his voice rumbling deep in his chest. "That freezing night on the ridge, everything I said was wrong."
I am fully aware, she replied smoothly, taking a sip of her tea. I informed you of your foolishness immediately.
You did. You handled my stubbornness very well. I deal with bitter herbs and impatient loggers all day, she teased, bumping her shoulder against his. Patience is a professional requirement in my line of work. Silas chuckled. The valley swallowed the last brilliant streaks of the summer sunset, painting the sky in deep purples. Buster twitched his paws, chasing a dream rabbit through the woods. Down by the water, the children's shouting abruptly stopped, signaling a truce had been reached. Silas reached out, wrapping his massive scarred hand over Evelyn's. It was a quiet habit they had formed a decade ago, one that never lost its weight. He thought about that freezing October afternoon, when he drove his wagon into town just to buy nails and tea. He thought about an 18-second conversation about a broken cabinet. He thought about a hound that refused to let him lie to himself, and a woman who stared down a blizzard and called him exactly what she needed. Thank you, he whispered into the summer night. Evelyn looked at him, her hazel eyes catching the porch light. For what? For using a different type of math than I did. She rested her head against his broad shoulder. Someone had to correct the ledger.
The heavy Oregon night wrapped around the cabin, and the ancient timberline stood as it always had. For Silas Thorne, it was more than enough. He had almost committed a catastrophic error. He had looked at the raw numbers of his life, 60 years, a dead wife, a lonely cabin, and mathematically concluded that his story was already over. He assumed the door to anything meaningful was permanently nailed shut. He was completely wrong. Age and tragedy leave real scars, absolutely. But Silas confused the simple tally of his years with the actual worth of his soul. He looked at the calendar and decided he was a lost cause. Evelyn didn't count his wrinkles. She counted the man who listened to her when society ignored her. She counted the man who poured her tea without asking for praise. She measured his worth by the custom-built bookshelves and the brutal, unfiltered honesty he offered her. It's a trap people fall into every single day. We are handed a chance at something genuine, and we spend weeks constructing elaborate arguments about why we don't deserve it. Silas Thorne finally stopped arguing with himself on a freezing Friday afternoon, marching into an apothecary shop to demand his life back. A heart doesn't care about the date on your birth certificate. It only cares about who you are in the quiet daily moments. You do not expire. You are never too late to be found.